Hey, welcome to Peninsula Christian Fellowship's video channel. We are so glad to have you with us today. For more information about who we are, check us out at welcometopcf.org or follow us on Facebook. Now, let's see what we have for you in today's video.
Greetings once again from a place that in many ways is very home-like for me. Many of you probably recognize this is in my office at the church building. And if you have not yet come and visited me here personally in the many years that maybe we both have been part of this church, please do. It is not like going to the principal's office when you're being held accountable for something. And so I welcome, I welcome you. So I'm going to follow off of last week a little bit where we talked about following Abraham and then how so many of the people that God has called followed the way Abraham followed, and that's his calling for us too. And today I'm really calling it looking for God or not during this whole time of change, this time when we're not just figuring out how to go about the business of life during these imposed limitations, but realizing that, and not just social circumstance, but God, I expect, wants to lead us into some new and different ways of living when we're beyond this, when we put this behind us, and I think He wants to use it for our advantage. And so we want to be looking for Him in the midst of it. Because following Him at any time now, whenever today is what will enable us to follow Him beyond it. And so we don't wait for a time to start following Him when it seems more advantageous to us. Every day is the right day to follow God in faith, and that happens deliberately. So, looking for God or not. So I have a big question, won't surprise you. Those of us that have been hanging out for many years know I like questions. I think if you ask the right questions, you're more inclined to get good answers. And my question for you right now is, what are we learning from the COVID-19 pandemic? And I mean you personally, and some things might come to mind rather quickly. I ask you to ponder that and maybe even ask God to help you look beyond whatever's obvious to you. Now, if we were together in the sanctuary on a Sunday morning, those of you that hang out here on a regular basis know that I would be walking around interviewing you. And I don't think that's a holdover from having been a talk radio host. I think it's just involving us and realizing that our collective perception is something that adds to who we are. But I can't do that. I can't walk around and take different answers from different ones of you audibly while we're all in the same room. So what are we learning? What are you learning from the COVID-19 crisis? The bigger question is, what is God trying to teach us? And what was He teaching some of our predecessors in somewhat similar times? You know, we talked about Jacob and Joseph last week, and it was this worldwide famine, this crushing famine that was used of God to bring about His greater will for His people. So let's take a look at some of them, and we'll start with Abraham. What about Abe? And I'm going to go with some different circumstances. What was God trying to teach them? What about Abraham when Lot left him? I hope you know that story. If not, please go back and read it in Genesis. Somewhere, I think, chapter 13, somewhere around there. And Lot was his nephew, and they realized that their possessions had become too great. They had so many flocks and herds that they couldn't adequately occupy the same land and tend to their flocks and herds, and squabbling had broken out between their herdsmen. And so Abram, who's the leader, he's the one in patriarchal authority over this whole mob, a large group of people, all his folks and all of Lot's folks. Lot was his nephew. And he said to his nephew, you choose wherever you want for your folks, and I'll take whatever's left. And Lot chose what looked good to him for him. And you probably know how that went for he and his folk, and how it went for Abe. What was God teaching Abraham, and what did Abraham learn? I think he learned, don't choose for yourself. How about his wife, Sarah? What do you think God was trying to teach her when she found herself pregnant at 91 years old? Now, she was 90, and the person of God showed up in physical form and is having a meal. He and a couple of archangels are having a meal with her husband, and God mentions again the promise that an innumerable number of people will come from Abraham and Sarah. They'd done the whole bungled thing with Hagar, and that didn't work, and still is not working to this day. And so Sarah was inside the tent, and she laughed dismissively, sort of mockingly. Of course, God heard her. Why did you? So I didn't laugh. God said, 1 year from now, you will give birth to a child, or you will be pregnant. And so she found herself pregnant at 91 years old. What do you think God wanted her to learn? Maybe to never doubt God's promise? How about Jacob, the father of the patriarchs, the one from whom came the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel? How about him when the famine hit? So this guy's well-to-do, in another part of the world, everything runs out, and God requires of him, he believes his former favorite son, Jacob, has died more than 17 years ago, and now he has Benjamin, a new youngest and favorite son, and he cannot gain access to what they need. This is God's doing through his missing son, Jacob, unless Benjamin becomes a part of it and goes down to the negotiations. And what do you suppose God wanted Jacob to learn when the famine hit? I think it might have been, don't hold anything back from God running your life. What about Moses at the burning bush experience? Now, it's been 40 years since he left Egypt and probably ran for his life. Myself, I think he killed that Egyptian because he knew he was supposed to be God's deliverer for the Hebrew people. It's just that he acted on his own and much too quickly. I think if you do the math on all the years and prophecies, I think he acted 10 years too soon. But now he's been out there pondering that for 40 years. I think often he thought, I just was sure I knew. I was sure that was it. And he's been out there for 40 years. And then this burning bush experience happens. What's the major thing God wanted Moses to learn? I think part of it had to be, don't require it to make sense. We tend to be a very practical people, and in a society that heretofore has been, things can be, I want a prospectus on that. If I'm going to invest certainly money, but maybe my time and effort, what's that going to turn into? How can I be confident that I'll get what I want out of this? And I think God was teaching Moses, who became the most humble of men, maybe from one of the most proud, don't require it to make sense. Remember, we're thinking about what God might want us to learn through this whole thing. What about David when Samuel shows up? This is one of my favorite stories. And God tells Samuel to go to the house of Jesse and anoint someone who will be the replacement king for Saul. We'll briefly touch on Saul in a moment. Saul was Israel's first king. They weren't supposed to have one, but they insisted on one, and God gave them Saul. Turns out Saul didn't handle it all that well, in fact, so poorly that God was taking it from him, and he said, I want you to go to the house of Jesse, and the new king will be among his sons. And so Samuel shows up and tells Jesse, bring all your sons out here. And surely it's this one, not this, no. And everyone, God says, that's not the one. And Jesse brought out all of his sons except David. And when Samuel says, well, is this all your sons? Well, no, there's David, but we keep him with the sheep. Now, being a shepherd was the lowliest occupation you could have in this culture, and that's where David was. And personally, I think, and don't anybody pick any theological fights over this, but I think if we look at all the evidence, I think that it's quite possible that Jesse was not married to David's mother, and maybe he wasn't considered a legitimate inheritor. But Samuel says, bring him. And so they bring him, of course, David is God's man. What about David when Samuel shows up? Because he knows he's been excluded. Hey, Samuel's here, wants all of your father's sons. Nobody called him. I think maybe God was trying to teach him to not limit God. Don't limit God. And too often we look at life and what's happening or not happening, what has happened or hasn't, or what might, we hope will happen. But we tend to see it through our eyes, and we unknowingly place limits on God according to what we think may or may not work. How about Elisha when Elijah shows up? I think. Now, he was determined to do his father's work, and if you read, the man is out there plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. This is a determined man. And Elijah, who's well known, shows up and chooses him to be his understudy, to be anointed. I think that part of the lesson for Elisha was let God choose your future. How about Mary, the future mother of Jesus, when the archangel Gabriel shows up? Wow. I mean, if ever anybody had to face something large and unexpected, I think part of what God needed her to learn was it's not about the risk. And too often we have a tendency to try and we see the risk and we want to minimize the risk, and so we start putting our conditions on what's learnable or what we might do in response to it. And she's a perfect example of saying, don't look at this through the risk. It's not about the risk. How about Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul? How about him on the road to Damascus? He oversaw the murder of Stephen, and he was on his way to Damascus to arrest and detain and bring back these rebels, these followers of Jesus who were disrupting the Hebrew system, the authority. And he has a very enlightening experience. I think God might have been saying to him, be careful who you make your enemy. Don't you love the irony of it? I mean, here he is, the enforcer to exterminate the church of Jesus, faith in Jesus, and he becomes the leading advocate in the world of that very thing. I think God might have been saying, be careful who you make your enemy. I look over this list, and of course there are many more, but I've got to draw the line somewhere here, but it's thorough enough, I think, for us to get a bit of a consistent picture. One of the things that strikes me large here is that now there are more women I could have chosen. There are 2 women in this list. But these women really, in many ways, rise above the others, Sarah and Mary, because both women brought forth miraculous life that would impact all of humanity. Wow. That's huge. And so look at their life, and if you want to recount some of the details, I'm referring to these people, there'll be notes on the website. So with all of this in mind, how much control did any of these people have? Because these are powerhouses. We look at them in hindsight, wow. They weren't powerhouses before God fingered them. Okay? They became powerhouses because God chose them and because they responded to him in faith and obedience. So how about you? How often has God impacted you in ways that you didn't initiate? Now, we should arrive at those pretty quickly. And I'll continue to say for the rest of my life, I've said countless times already, at the point that we even care about God, that's Him working in us, drawing us for our own good. I think about how this works, and of course, I can't help but think back on Ravel and me and our history since we turned to God, and how much control we had over anything at these critical points. I look back at our call to pastoral ministry. I had told my mother in my very rebellious past, when I was committed to my sin and lived it openly, even in front of her, my sweet mother would just smile sweetly and say to me, "Well, that's fine, Kurt, but you're going to serve God one day." And I would say, "Mother, I expect I will get right with God one day, but I'm never going to be a preacher, so you can forget that." Well, she had the last laugh on that one. Before she died, she got to be a part of this congregation for 6 years and saw me in pastoral ministry for about 20 or 25 years. So that one, we were not expecting that. And very early on in our life of faith, God surprised us and called us to adopt a 12-year-old child. Weren't expecting that one, but we knew it was Him. And we now have, that daughter of ours is now 50 years old. 38 years it's been. Wow, thank you, Lord. I was headed off to school in preparation for pastoral ministry, and I had a scholarship, and we had plans for housing and everything, and the Lord unexpectedly closed that door and sent us to an entire another ministry training environment. When we entered full-time pastoral ministry, we wound up moving to a city where we didn't know anyone and no one knew us. No one was waiting for us. And that was just, we had no control other than to respond to God. And then when we got there, I hadn't given the whole pro-life abortion conflict 5 minutes of thought. And the Lord arrested me in my tracks so suddenly and so overwhelmingly. One day I was in my truck and I had to pull to the side of the road. I couldn't even continue. I was so overwhelmed. And He called me to initiate a pro-life ministry that we wound up impacting the entire state. Hundreds of people that we know of. 6 abortionists quit. 3 of them left town. We saw Him do some virtually miraculous, maybe miraculous things. It was really cool. Moving back to Tacoma from Eugene, the Lord used a call. We moved to Tacoma because the ministry we were a part of, the Agape Force, was large into drama and music, had been on the cover of Christianity Today and Charisma Magazine and all of that, and was very much into performing arts, and we're opening Ridgecrest Academy of the Arts, which would be a college of performing arts, and had this huge campus, big downtown building and all of that, and they brought me up to be the administrator to run the nuts and bolts business side of this thing. And the day after we got here, the Lord revealed, "Yeah, I'm not going to have you do that. I just used that to get you here." And He said, "No, I want you in the church," and have been in the church and pastoral ministry ever since. Merging with Peninsula Christian Fellowship 23 years ago. Dennis Fuquay, one of the original pastors of this congregation, he and I had been friends for years, and we were praying together, and we believed the Lord started showing us, "Hey, I want to, not just you guys 2 men, but I want you to draw these 2 congregations together," and He did, and that was 23 years ago. We didn't see that coming. And then, I told you last time, selling our house in Tacoma. We'd been there for 21 years. And a house that God gave us. Well, you want to talk about providential, if not miraculous. I mean, how we ended up in that house and how God pulled it off is, it's an amazing story we don't have time for right now. Like all of those Bible people, our only control was obedience, Ravel and I. And we did not want to be either Saul or Jonah. Saul wouldn't wait, Jonah wouldn't go. And they wouldn't obey God. So we believed that our only control was to hear God and obey Him. So what is God's big lesson for us, all of us, through this corona pandemic? Personally, I think the big lesson is we're not in control. And let's realize that, and let's not fall victim to the temptation to think or speak or behave as if we should be, or as if somehow control is being taken from us. Because if we're God's, we never were. Now, I'm no Christian fatalist, and I see a pretty comfortable merge between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man. But he calls upon our control is to obey him and to relinquish control. We're going to look at the best example of that in just a moment here. We're not in control, but God still is. So you and I are called to act like we know and believe he is, and to trust him in the midst of what's happening. Even if we don't like it, even if we don't understand it, even if it seems wrong. God hasn't fallen off the throne and no one has yanked him off of it. And he's still bringing about his will. I want to read just a little bit of scripture to you from 1 Peter. I chuckled when he took me here. Okay. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. Now, I didn't write that. So you decide what you're going to do with it. In John 5:19, Jesus, the Son of God, the creative agent of the Godhead who spoke into being all that is and by the power of his own will holds it all together, keeps it from crashing, said, I don't initiate anything on my own, what I do or what I say. He said, I only do what I see the Father doing actively on a regular basis. In John 15, he gave this great illustration of vines. They all understood vines and branches. He said, I am the true vine and my Father is the vine dresser. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. And then in John 20:21, he said to them and to us, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. God already wants what's best for us. He does. I hope you believe that. He's already doing what's best to get us there. I hope you believe that, regardless of what it looks like. And we are called to believe him ahead of time, whether we see or understand or like it or whatever. Faith in him is about who he is, not what he'll do or when he'll do it. What we know he's promised, we are certain he will do. But who he is towards us was proved on the cross and the resurrection. And you and I live accordingly. He hasn't changed, and he wants us to live in the confident faith that he's still who he's always been. Father, thank you so much that we have this long string of predecessors who lived, and they went through some tough stuff and some odd stuff. And Lord, you perplexed them in so many ways. Pregnant at 91, really? My goodness. And so, Lord, there's just Would you help us? And I'm asking right now for myself and for all of us who respond to you, who care about you, who love you, who want to love in your behalf, Lord, to fill us up with faith and hope, which is a confident expectation with pleasure of the future that you haven't brought about yet, and love, which is receiving your love and filling up so that we love others in your behalf. And that's the predominant impact we make regardless of what's going on around us in the practical world. Lord, I know you're going to help us with that if we simply ask you on a regular basis. Thank you so much, God. Lord, bless my brothers and sisters. Fill them with encouragement. And Lord, help us to be looking forward to you every day. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. See you soon. Love you.